1. 1.
Welcome, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. So thank you for tuning in CCG Global Dialogue and live from CCG head office here in Beijing. My name is Henry Huiyao Wang. I'm the founder and the president of the Center for China and Globalization. So welcome Lord Jim O'Neill and Mr. Leslie Maasdorp. So thank you both for tuning in at this
recording in progress
special time. And of course, we are joining both of you to our Global Dialogue series to talk about the past, present, and the future of the BRICS, and also the future globalization development. So this is really a right time to talk about
when I reflect on the economic developments of 20 years ago, and compare it to what our famous projection showed, developments of 20 years ago has surpassed considerably more any of the scenarios that I and my team assumed in the early days of the BRICS idea. And in many ways, and I'm sure is often a feature of many of your discussions with fascinating people, one of the most remarkable things of the economic history of my lifetime and before is the performance of China the past 30 years, 20 years of which has been a BRIC. It's also true that by and large, India has essentially achieved the broad growth path that we outlined. And that's why today China and India are so much bigger parts of the world economy than they were 20 years ago. It is the case, unfortunately, that the other two in the original acronym of mine, Brazil and Russia, after having a very good first decade where they surpassed also all expectations of ours, have actually had an equally very poor second decade. And ironically, each of those countries' share of global GDP is almost back to where it was 20 years ago. And in that sense, the objective reality is when it comes to their economic performance, they've been a disappointment. And I would add, unfortunately, the same is of course true for South Africa also. And whilst there are many, many differences between them, I think at the core dilemma, which relates to policy issues I'll come on to, each of those three show signs of the much discussed commodities curse, which can often be a problem for many emerging economies that are trying to break through the middle income trap. And this is a challenge that each of those three countries faces in the future, in my opinion, even though there are many differences between them. Second thing to say, as you touched on, Henry, especially in the very first paper of 20 years ago, my whole point of creating the acronym deliberately is a play on the English word BRICS, as in building bricks, is that it seemed already 20 years ago that global governance wasn't adequately represented by big emerging economies. And that was the basis of my paper, especially coming 2 years after the creation of the euro and the introduction of a single currency for every big continental European country, it seemed to me very clear that there was no great case for single representation of each of Italy, Germany, and France in global economic governance. And so the G7 could be both consolidated and expanded to include important emerging economies. And whilst that never happened, of course, 7 years later in 2008, prompted by the global financial crisis, we had the advent of the G20, which at its core was in reality to bring in these big emerging economies into the center of global economic governance. And at the time, if we would have had this discussion in 2008 or even 2010, I would have been very excited about what this meant for more representative and more equitable global governance. And of course, importantly with it, as I mentioned in the FT story, we also had the introduction of the Financial Stability Forum, which became the Financial Stability Board. And in 2010, we had the first significant reform in the voting shares and structure of the IMF and the World Bank. And with it, the change in the basket of the SDR to include the Chinese RMB. Unfortunately, and hence why the FT picked on this title, in the decade since, and unfortunately so strongly exhibited during this crisis there has not been any further significant improvements in global governance at all. And the contrast between the G20 meeting of 2020 and 2021 and those of 2008 through 2010, in my opinion, is very disappointing and something that needs to be urgently changed for the future of all 7 billion people around the world. And then the third thing, very quickly, on the BRICS political group itself, I think, as I know, because I talk to Leslie about this quite often, on a sort of unnoticed level, there are very important positive developments that have taken place with a whole series of ongoing discussions between BRICS ministers, whether they be economic or health or political, that take place all the while. And by definition, that is a great development, as of course was the development or the introduction of the new development bank that Leslie represents. But it is the case, in my opinion, and one has to be careful to be diplomatic, and I don't want to offend anybody, but it is the case that the actual cooperation between the BRICS political leaders on an economic basis has not really demonstrated any evidence that it's materially helped any of their economies. And I finish for now with the rather sober reflection that if you look at the collective economic performance before and since the BRICS political group was established, it has weakened. Now that may have nothing to do with the introduction of the BRICS political group, but it certainly raises the possibility, as I've touched on, that they haven't so far done anything to ensure stronger economic performance between them. But I apologize for already talking quite long, but I said, I could have talked for the whole hour, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of these topics.
No, thank you, Jim. I think, as the creator of this BRICS concept, actually led to the BRICS country groups and also summits and all those things. I mean, the origin is from you. I mean, you are very visionary in terms of proposing this very practical idea, and then you are a champion for the BRICS countries. I think, even though I think FT has actually used the title as little sensational, but actually the BRICS countries still, I mean, as an emerging power, still particularly China, is doing still relatively well. But maybe just follow up on your this opening remarks. I just wondering that you envision at that time that the global governance system maybe can bring in more BRICS countries to participate. We shouldn't be a Western country dominated system. You recommended that BRICS countries should be have more share in the international mechanism like MIF, World Bank, and institution like that. So, and of course G20, but actually, we see some ideological and political divide on the G20. But also you mentioned about G10, G7. Can that be expanded to G10, maybe including a few BRICS countries? Those are really very, very good ideas, I think. So what do you see the BRICS countries in a global governance system? Now, I mean, we have to really work together as a multilateralism. I think just not too long ago, we had this global, BRICS summit, and President Xi actually mentioned about how we can continue to support multilateralism. And so what do you see the BRICS countries' role in the future in the global governance? Any new ideas or recommendations?
I can't. Again, three very quick, but in this case, definitely much briefer responses. The first one is I can't resist repeating a joke that I've said for much of the past 15 years and discussed with Leslie and his colleagues at the New Development Bank. Given how the political group and the New Development Bank came about because of my acronym, I'm still waiting to be made honorary president of the Development Bank. The second thing to say, slightly more seriously, is it is remarkable when I look back 20 years ago as to what was in my head and what I thought would be much more optimal for the world. How many of those thoughts are still in my head now, even though the world has changed so much? If I just answer this part of the second thing with two subparts very quickly. With the existence of the euro and a shared monetary and fiscal policy in Germany, France, and Italy, I don't really understand the logic as to why each of the three of them, all of which have very poor domestic economic growth performance, warrant a seat separately at some kind of global table of economic policy affairs. It is completely lacking in any rationale other than economic history, and perhaps, of course, the fact they all come from the same continent and have the same shared democratic values. And then the second part of answering that, I often think this is perhaps why we have some of the difficulties that we have in the world, because as great as the G20 development was, as anybody that participates in these G20 meetings will always say to me, it's too many countries and too many people to be a especially useful framework for making tough decisions. I'm a big believer in deliberately recognizing the difference between compromise and conciliation. And the more people that are in a decision-making group who are bored, by definition, the more people default to compromise, usually the weakest compromise, instead of deliberately trying to conciliate. And I think a reformed smaller group inside the G20, which would still be along the lines of what I said 20 years ago, would make a huge amount of sense. And then the last part of answering you on this for now is I think it would help if the BRICS leaders themselves had a stronger shared collective priority more frequently on some key issues. You will know, Henry, yourself, and Leslie will also, that there has been occasions where there was a small window for important global leadership positions, such as the IMF or the World Bank, to come from a big emerging country. I'm thinking of particularly about 5-6 years ago when the positions were up, and there did seem to be a chance that we could break the mold of one coming from Europe and one coming from the US. But one of the reasons why that never happened is because the BRICS countries themselves didn't be strong enough to share who that person should be from the emerging world. And the third thing to say, and because you touched on it in your intro, again, I know because of my deep involvement in global health, in the past 2 months, some of the BRICS countries have been very opposed to the idea of the introduction of a global health board under the G20, despite it clearly being in their own very, very strong interests. And I think it partly reflects the difficulties that the BRICS leaders have themselves on sometimes coming to a common position, not just for themselves, but to contribute for the greater interest for the world.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim. I think for those very stimulating ideas that you have been proposed in the past, but I've continued to think in that way. I agree with you. I think that maybe G20 is a bit too many, but I also noticed that the chairman of the Council of Foreign Relations, Richard, has actually proposed G6, EU and the US, China, India, and Japan, and all the big countries. So that
idea. Sorry, Henry. That idea would be very similar to the one that I suggested and still believe.
That's right. I think you're right. So your idea is actually to bring China, India, and other emerging market a bit more into this global governance system.
Yes.
That'd be really would be very, very helpful. And I agree with that. If this old global governance system, including health system, is dominated by West countries, and then maybe sometimes getting politicalized, those BRICS countries probably are reluctant to play part. But I think we need to create a climate gradually to improve that. I agree with you. So Leslie, I mean, you are the BRICS man, basically. I mean, one of the products, as I agree, I think Jim should be the honorary chair of BRIC, this new development bank. But you are the man also running the think tank, and you coming from BRICS countries. So what do you think about this? One of the achievement of BRICS countries, that by setting up this new development bank, and also in our head office in Shanghai, you are having a new office, brand new, to move in soon. I understand. Also now, from last several years, new development bank has already land, $224 billion, dollars and things like that. So probably you can give us your perspective about BRICS and new development bank.
Thank you very much for having me again. Good seeing you also, Jim. First point I'd like to make, and also I want to just maybe frame this around maybe three propositions. The first point is that I think it is early days, Henry, to assess the sort of historical significance of BRICS. I think also it is 20 years since Jim in November 2001 wrote the paper, but it is only actually 12 years since the BRICS leaders and BRICS as we know it today. In 2009, the 5 leaders came together, and it's actually only 6 years since the new development bank have been created. So I think it's important to look at it through that historical lens. The 20 years is more the concept that Jim sort of conceptualized have been in vogue, but the institutional formation is much sort of younger. So we're very much at the early stages of its evolution. My proposition is that what BRICS have done is created a platform for what later on could become, or is already the embryo for a more emerging markets platform within these global governance structures. Now, as you know, the G20 was only formed 22, 23 years ago or so, but within the G20, these countries already there was an informal sort of network amongst these large emerging markets. Indonesia, maybe Mexico, and others were also part of that dialogue, and they were at the forefront of articulating for reform within the World Bank, within the IMF, which led to what is known as Voice Reform 2009, 2010, as Jim just referenced. So the BRICS countries played a much bigger role over this period to help engineer those reforms to make the global governance system more credible, more legitimate, because we do have still today a mismatch between the economic power of the large emerging markets and their political weight as represented within the official structures. So the G7 is obviously, being overtaken by the G20, and it has definitely democratized decision-making in many respects. But let me make the second proposition, and maybe there was a reason why Jim didn't cover this in his article for, I'm sure just because of the length, but there are some significant achievements of the New Development Bank and the institutions that BRICS have created that maybe was not flagged in the article. The first one is that many people don't know that there's another institution that BRICS created. Well, it's a virtual institution. It's called the Contingent Reserve Arrangement. And essentially what this is, it's a facility. It's a pooling of foreign exchange reserves of $100 billion, the bulk coming from China, $41 billion from China, 18 from India, 18 from Russia, and so on, and 5 from South Africa. Should any of our 5 countries have balance of payment pressures, Henry, this is a facility. Traditionally, you'd go to the IMF if you have balance of payment liquidity challenges. This is now, this was put in place. Again, the treaty was signed in 2014 already, and not many people know about it because it is a virtual fund. It's a pooling of reserves, and it will play a very important role in the event of a global liquidity crisis. The second key and most significant achievement of BRICS have been the creation of the New Development Bank. This is an institution. It has $50 billion of subscribed capital. It has now approved, up until last week, $31 billion of sustainable infrastructure. The bank have this huge additional sort of symbolically, the fact that it has never financed a coal-fired power station. It has a completely green and sustainable persona, which I think is also very important in this age of climate change that we are living through. So the second point I'd like to make is that New Development Bank is also still at its early stages, but it will also morph and mutate into a more emerging markets bank. You might know a month ago, we admitted United Arab Emirates, Bangladesh, as well as Uruguay, and we're on the cusp of introducing significant new emerging markets over the next number of months and years to come. So it was born, the concept was born in 2001. It sort of, was still a baby by 2015 when the institutions was created. But one has to look at longer historical lenses to assess what potential impact this acronym, which Jim was the creator of, will have on the world.
Yeah. Thank you, Leslie. I think you're right. I mean, we should be a bit more patient and then give a bit more time. And of course, the BRICS country, I mean, they come along and then they form this New Development Bank, which is a great achievement, I think. And also now they have done so many, disbursement for the sustainable development, but also you just said they have a big facility also set aside in case that anything needed. So this is a great achievement. I really congratulate. I think that the achievement of New Development. But of course, we have more to come in the future. I'm glad to hear all those other emerging countries are joining the New Development Bank, and they set a very good examples of that. I'm sure Jim has a bit high expectations as a creator, but I'm sure you would be pleased to see the bank has done very well. Now I would like to actually to change a bit of the subject. Recently we published a book called Consensus and Conflict, and actually Jim has actually contributed a paper for that, and called "What is the right way to structure global health? The case for radical new organizations and thinking." So thank you, Jim, for your contribution of this paper to the book that myself and Alistair Meacham, both of us edited, and it's actually published internationally by Jim talked about Nature, actually by Springer Nature publisher, and then that book has actually already downloaded over 110 and 200 and 200,000 already around the world. It's really a great book that has been well received. It's called Consensus of Conflict: China and the Globalization in the 21st Century, and of course we have you contribute a great piece to that on this well read article. It's really great. What is the right way to structure global health, which is a timely subject, and the case for radical and new organizations. So as you wrote in this article, actually, Jim, you wrote about your experience leading a group called the Global Review of Antimicrobial Resistance. So AMR investigated the lack of development of new useful antimicrobial and excessive use of antibiotics and its risk and enormous economic cost from the global health threat, which has been also proven by the COVID. So it may be just in time we talk about this, the idea that you have in this book, how the international global health system and how recently the outbreak of Omicron as another variant of COVID virus, and then continue to spread of the Delta variant. So what's your, maybe can you elaborate on your concept about this global health reorganization?
Again, thank you, Henry. I'd be delighted to talk about this briefly because it's something I've become very, very passionate about. To make it easier to talk about antimicrobial resistance, which is, even for those of us that whose natural speaking language is English, it's quite a mouthful. So it often abbreviates to AMR to make it easier.
Yeah.
But I also often say that it's probably intellectually the most interesting thing I've ever done in my life. And I've had a very fortunate professional career, but leading a global independent review into the challenge of AMR was fascinating for many, many reasons, but at the core because of its global importance. And it's often known, particularly in contrast to COVID or because of COVID, as the silent pandemic that is killing as many. And my review became, in the world of global health, quite famous for saying that if we don't do something about the problem of antimicrobials, particularly resistance to antibiotics, by 2050, we will end. I can hear. Yeah. If we don't do something about it by 2050, we could have 10 million people a year always dying because antibiotics won't work anymore. And with it, a colossal loss of economic activity. And what is fascinating about the mood now because of this current crisis is those few health specialists that looked at our numbers and occasionally said 5 years ago that maybe they were exaggerated. Actually now they realize that, on the contrary, if you don't deal with global health threats, they can be worse than global financial threats. And the last time I looked, the loss of economic activity during COVID in the past 2 years around the world is 3 times worse than that in the financial crisis. And this came from a global health crisis. Which takes me to the second core point of the chapter I had the privilege of writing for your book. And by the way, congratulations to you and Alistair on such very powerful sales so far. And I hope it will become 10 times or 100 times bigger, given its importance. No, seriously, given the importance of the issues. But the central idea is we need to stop treating health as some place in the corner that we only ever focus on when the problem becomes right in the middle of our face. Mm-hmm. And just as the FSB was created to try and anticipate that the global financial system will always have enough capital and it will be ready for the next global financial crisis, we need to do the same thing with health. And the central proposition is to have a global health and finance board under the G20, which would be represented by both finance ministers and health ministers. And in order to do that, we will be able to have a truly effective global surveillance system for health, adequate financing of the WHO instead of this slightly bizarre voluntary-based system. And every week of our lives, take for example, this so-called Omicron variants of COVID we're currently dealing with, and Leslie's country, South Africa, is suffering because of the very rapid decision to impose travel constraints. If we had a proper global health and finance board, we would be prepared to think in advance, all around the world together, how these things should be dealt with before they happen. And by that, it would not stop global health problems, but it would stop them from having the economic and financial damage and the destruction which we're still living through nearly 2 years after the onset of COVID. And I've become very passionate about that. And together with some of the people led by Mario Monti on the commission that I was part of, we are still trying to lobby very extensively for the initiatives introduced to have a task force to look at this under the G20 of Italy's presidency, to have that taken up by the Indonesian presidency, and for this to become a central part of future global policymaking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great, Jim. Yeah, no, that's really a very important task you're championing, and also has contributed so much to this international global health system. And of course, in our book, actually, we just mentioned this consensus or conflict. You stated that matching WHO's role and responsibility with the global reality is very important. So it is very true that lessons learned from COVID are desperately needed, in terms to transform the reforms of global health governance system. And on Wednesday, just this week, and members of WHO has agreed to set up an intergovernmental body to negotiate a draft of global pandemic treaty. And so do you see a good sign? And so in terms of global health reform system and the global governance on that, where do you see, countries like, BRICS countries, China, European, EU, American, and how we can work together rather than, we have become so political, yes, driven by different countries or source of origin. I mean, it should be coming, either from nature or animal, but we can have a predetermined is a man-made from lab. That really soured the mood to collaborate. So how do you think about, yes, we can better collaborate on those issues?
Yeah, I think there is some quite easy wins that could be made, Henry, to be honest. And again, I'm very, very grateful that you give me an opportunity to talk about this, particularly with an audience in China, because China is in a position to take great leadership on this topic, given its importance in itself, but also at the core of the BRICS countries. But I'd say three very easy things need to happen. As I said, there has already been a task force now established following the G20 meeting. And I know that the WHO is in the center of trying to see how to implement two parallel things. How could you practically implement a global health and finance board? And secondly, how can you ensure representative financing of something like global vaccine distribution, or money for new antibiotics, or many other things, but crucially, the financing of the WHO itself. When we stand back from what's going on and look at it from 40,000 feet, the WHO should be financed in the same sort of way that the IMF is, for it to be a voluntary thing, which allows, for example, the brilliant contributions of the Gates Foundation to be a crucial thing for such a centrally important organization for the world. It's crazy. And so we need to get, hopefully under the Indonesian presidency, some agreement to these simple things. And the final thing to say, which I'm describing as simple, but this part of it is going to have to emerge through time. I think involving the private sector, especially in the West, we need to rediscover what I describe as profit with purpose. In the world of high finance, for much of my professional life, a lot of international business appears to be profit for the purpose of profits, which is great. Making a lot of money is great because that's what generates wealth. But we have to make sure that societal challenges can't just be regarded as the responsibility of other people, and have that at the center of allowing and supporting our policymakers to think more inclusively of what economists describe as externalities, and internalizing them to be part of regular thinking. And that goes back to why a global health and finance board is so powerfully needed, which, by the way, is not that different than what we need, of course, to tackle climate change.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, on the climate change, I mean, we had, China, US actually issued a joint statement there. So yes. Shows that you can be collaborating and take some lead on those two big countries.
Sorry, Henry. One other important point I meant to mention very quickly is when I discussed this with an astute Chinese observer recently, when I was bemoaning the fact that I didn't think China was enthusiastic yet for this idea as I hoped. This person pointed out that so far in the brief history of the Financial Stability Board, every leader, the 4 leaders of the FSB, have all come from G7 countries. And therefore, going back to our earlier points, if you really want to create a new body that is truly shared by G20 members and inclusive of emerging countries, a very sensible thing from Western countries is to consciously, deliberately encourage a leadership position in terms of a president or chair from an important emerging country.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is again visionary, and then you are really a champion for the BRICS countries. You're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, China is doing quite a lot. I mean, since the pandemic, China has pledged President Xi actually pledged $2 billion to developing countries. I know that President Biden pledged another $2 billion at the G7 summit, and President Xi pledged again another $2 billion in another. So I'm glad to see that kind of a healthy competition. But also, China has donated almost 2 billion doses of vaccine. And just this week, President Xi announced at the FOCA, China-Africa Summit, China has donated another billion, and also including joint production of another billion vaccine to African countries. So China actually does a lot already. And but you're absolutely right. If those financial board was the healthy board and is vacant for China, and then it's not really letting China play some active role there, it's not fair. I mean, that's the problem. I think when you have this international mechanism in discussion, China is always on the side and not really playing some active role. But actually, I think the China actually does a lot already, and we should group into that and have a healthy cooperation on that. So talk about this cooperation. I mean, Leslie, I want to come to you now. You know that, and also this week, I mean, EU President and Chair announced, European is providing 35 billion euros on the EU gateway. I mean, on the infrastructure, just these 2 days. And of course, President Biden, passed a law about 1.2 trillion infrastructure bill, and G7 also proposed Build Back Better World, B3W. And of course, this is the 8th year of China doing the BRI, Belton Road Initiative. So infrastructure is really, I can see that as the largest largest common denominator and attraction for the world for the next 7 decades, probably, that we can still working on for many developing countries, and maybe another new, I'm not saying Marshall Plan, but maybe a global stimulating plan for the world to work together, rather than we are getting into this kind of geopolitical fight and argument. So what do you think? I mean, as a banker, development bank, the infrastructure, the opportunity in the developing countries for BRICS countries, for US, EU, other Western countries. What are the, what can be done for those things, and what's your assessment?
Thanks, Andrew. I think firstly, I think the recent pronouncements in a lead up to COP26 is a clear indication, and because of all the announcements you've just made reference to, it is going to be, I think, a period of renaissance for development banks because of the significant new focus on sustainable infrastructure. There is so much new financing needed to replenish existing infrastructure and to build new infrastructure that is resilient and sustainable. So I think one of the first key points to make in this regard, and Jim already touched on it, is that traditionally, people have always looked at infrastructure as hard economic infrastructure in terms of ports, airports, high-speed rail, and so on, power infrastructure. But social infrastructure is also now becoming very, very critical. Jim just mentioned the commission that he was part of, which looks at health and sustainable development in the European Union. And within multilateral banks, we're also now placing huge emphasis on that component. Coming back to infrastructure, I think one of the biggest significant developments here in China is the increasing focus now on greening the Belton Road. And in fact, I'm hoping that many people hope that maybe the words will be used, green Belton Road, and not just making reference to try to green the Belton Road, because that will send a very powerful signal. And China's already done this to a degree, if you like, with the announcement that it will no longer finance coal-fired power outside of China. As you know, the announcement was made in the build-up before COP. So infrastructure can play a very critical role going forward towards greater sustainable development. But there's one other point I wanted to make, which is also very critical, Henry, and that is that our institutions that we have right now are not necessarily fit for purpose for the new realities that we are confronted with. Jim made reference to what he called externalities because of there's obviously the pandemic that we've just lived through, there's climate change, there's a whole range of other issues that are transnational, that cross borders, or spillovers, as it is often called. And our institutions are not necessarily suited to deal with these. This might be a moment to go back to ask the questions whether we in fact have the right institutions in place, and whether we should reform some, innovate, in order to make sure we can tackle these new challenges that we are confronted with. But the last point I want to make is that the biggest potential, game-changing potential for the infrastructure is mobilizing capital from the private sector. As you know, Jim, public sector is very constrained fiscally. Multilateral banks have capital adequacy limitations. The biggest pools of capital is out there in institutional, in terms of the pools of savings, are in private hands. We need to find a way to de-risk infrastructure in such a way that we can make it attractive for these institutional investors to invest in sustainable infrastructure. And a lot of that is being done at the moment. And I think we're going to see a significant movement towards crowding in private sector capital in the next 5 to 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah. Thank you, Leslie. Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, there's many things. I mean, social infrastructure is also very important. Health system, financial system, and of course now we're talking about hard infrastructure, where I think all the world I think we're on a consensus now. The world needs infrastructure. I mean, from US, EU, China. China probably does the best now. The total length of the speed railway in China is equal to the next 10 countries combined. Probably where the US military budget is equal to the next 10 countries combined. Maybe we should spend more on the infrastructure worldwide, and that's why I really think that Jim is really great visionary when he talks about how we can reform IMF, World Bank, and we have more emerging countries participation there, which I think is really a very wise suggestion. But now, Jim, I mean, World Bank, and now we also have other development banks. We have AIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and one new development bank. Can we have some kind of international bank board of some kind, or a consortia, or alliance of can we combine B3W and BRI, or maybe upgrade the AIB to GIB, a Global Infrastructure Bank. So something in that direction, because I see how we can multilateralize this global initiative on infrastructure. Maybe it's time now, if this is the consensus of every major countries, why can't we work on this? Because now you see the WTO actually, because of this virus, we are postponing the MC12 at the end of this month now. But infrastructure seems every country has the consensus. But how we tackle that, how we can really work with BI and B3W. Jim, your opinion, please.
I love the spirit of how your mind approaches this question. It's very consistent with the spirit of how my own mind is, especially since I led the AMR review. And that we need to have people open their minds to think a bit more, let's call it laterally, instead of in such a narrow, conventional way. Because otherwise, as the past 20 years or longer has shown, we cannot deal with the challenges that the world is faced with. And three specific quick things in this regard. First of all, I can't miss the opportunity in this regard, in the spirit of Leslie's comments about social infrastructure spending, but linking it to global health. One thing that all 5 BRICS countries share very clearly is the significant challenge with drug-resistant TB. And I have said for many, many years, an obvious, simple, clear area of genuine, fruitful policy cooperation for the BRICS countries is to try and finance new, effective vaccines or drugs to deal with TB. Because otherwise, the BRICS countries will not reach their potential. And that's just one simple example. But secondly, in the broader spirit, arguably, as both of you would know, the World Bank's investing on the IFC already could be the basis for exactly such a more ambitious global entity. But the IFC and all these other ones need to think in a truly global public purpose sense. And the last thing to say in the context of this, and I throw it back to the wonderful spirit of how your mind is approaching it, Henry. The idea of a global health and finance board should be seen really ultimately sometime in another decade or longer, a global public goods board. In that we have a world in which economic policy is not just trying to deal with very narrowly measured outcomes that are defined by conventional macroeconomics. Because what we have found in our lifetime is they generate these enormous externalities. And they become so big that they threaten the very framework in which we all live on. And so you are exactly right about the kind of degree of open-mindedness and the degree of thinking of these things in a different framework than we have done for much of certainly of my professional lifetime.
Yeah. Thank you, Jim. I think you're right. China is actually one of the transformation. China was able to lift 800 million people out of poverty. I think this great infrastructure transformation is taking place in China. So now they want to probably collaborate with the world on those infrastructure. That's where BRI is really implemented for the last 8 years now. And as a matter of fact, we're just tomorrow the China-Laos railway will be opened. We're connecting the ASEAN countries. So you see that kind of infrastructure activity will really be the drive and the peacemaker for the world. I agree. You said IFC and all the other international financial institutions. Can we really revigorate, revitalize those institutions with the AIB, with New Development Bank? So Leslie, what do you think about how we can get all the development bank work together, on BI and on many other initiatives?
I think there's already very deep collaboration amongst the development banks. It's now deepening because of the climate change agenda. I mean, as you might know, recently at COP26, the multilateral banks issued a joint statement where essentially almost half of all of their future development assistance and exposures, lending, whether it be loans, guarantees, equity, will be towards climate finance. Most of the institutions had targets before of 25, 30, 40%. It is now progressively moving up. So that deep collaboration is already happening, but we haven't yet consolidated it as a system. We still function as individual institutions, and we can probably better act as a system if we act in a more complementary fashion. But I think what the climate change agenda has done is kind of be a catalyst for that greater collaboration. There's already discussion, for example, Kenneth Rogoff argued recently in a Project Syndicate article for the creation of a World Carbon Bank, because if each country put in place their own carbon policies, like the European Union just put in place a carbon border adjustment mechanism, set of proposals, we will have very inefficient outcomes. So I think some institutional reform might still be necessary, Henry, but what I can definitely indicate is that multilateral institutions have deepened their collaboration over the last couple of years, more so recently because of the collective agenda on climate change.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Leslie. Yeah, I want to come back to Jim for another question. When you were served as a commercial secretary for the UK government, and all those international, the new trading schemes, like RCEP will be effective January 1st. CPTPP is another emerging new global, at least for the Asia Pacific trading system. And UK is planning for join that. China is planning for join that. So what do you think of this kind of new, 21st century, new high standards trading system that can really revitalize the global system, including the WTO reform? How do you think those initiatives can happen? And also the relation between China and UK maybe can work on these new initiatives.
Thank you again, Henry. I mean, this is another question that could take more than an hour to answer, but I'll say two things, which are contradictory. First of all, and this is talking very much as an economist, quite often I think people over-exaggerate the importance of legal trade deals. If you look at patterns of global trade, or the best example I can ever give you is that at least until the past 2 years, Germany had started to export more to China than it did to its neighbor Italy, even though it was part of the same EU with a common free trade deal and the same monetary system. And it's because, of course, of the enormous rise in domestic demand in China and demand for the kind of goods that Germany is so powerful at. And the truth of the matter is global trade is really driven by relative rates of domestic demand. And as part of that, and linked to aspects of your previous question that I didn't have a chance to talk about, I would love to see within the BRICS and separately, China and India cooperating on some of these things a lot more. Because if you look at how they've emerged the past 20 years, and if you look at the world the next 20 years, if China and India get their own trade cooperation right, it would literally without any exaggeration, transform patterns of global trade. And that would be the basis of so many other positive things that would happen. The contradictory part is, of course, and that's my second point, is that we need to have more and more sophisticated trade agreements to deal with the rules in which we all engage with each other around the world. But it is not as important as making sure the countries that are behind those trade deals want to see the opportunities being equally shared between them around the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yes, I agree. I mean, absolutely. I mean, the BRIC countries should really have further collaboration. I mean, they are already, very, very important in the players. And I think that, particularly as you mentioned, China and India, I mean, being the two largest neighbors, I mean, have a similar 1.3, 1.4 billion people. And there are so many things. I've been to India a few times, and I saw so much potential for China to companies to work there. I mean, there's so much to invest and to collaborate. And of course, I think, if we can really get these two countries to collaborate, I mean, you're right. The global trade pattern could be changed as well. And because China has already become the second largest economy, and you projected India could someday take over Japan, the third largest economy, and that could still happening. And I think there's all the reasons that we should collaborate for the BRICS countries. That's what President Xi said. At the BRICS summit, the multilateralized, and we should support and collaborate and work together. I think we almost come to the end of a discussion. I know you've been quite busy, but we still have a 2 or 3 questions from the medias we collected, and my staff was showing me there was almost 100,000 people watching us online, and so this is a very important section. There's one question from a major Chinese news from China News Agency. It talks about the BRICS cooperation involves countries in South America, Europe, and Asia. What is the significance of cooperation between Europe and Asia, and cultural exchanges between East and West? And what about BRICS countries and Western countries and US, EU, and all the others?
If I realized there was going to be 100,000 people here, Henry, I would have gone to the hairdressers and made myself look much better. But I'm very grateful. I have a simple part of answering that. I'm a very fortunate person that at least until COVID and for much of the previous 30 years traveled around the world frequently. And in my view, one of the greatest things that ever happened to me was the good fortune and the ability to be able to travel to countries in Africa, Latin America, of course, Europe, North America, and in particular to Asia. And you can only really think truly globally if you experience how people in local societies feel, because that only gives you a flavor of being able to understand the way people think and the cultural differences. And so, of course, and I would argue one of the great strengths of the BRICS group, which is often overlooked, the fact that it does include Brazil from Latin America, 2 countries from Asia, and Russia that's in the middle of them, itself is a source of great cultural and geopolitical strength. And so the more these cultural exchanges can take place, and the societal and economic things that can be thought of for shared benefit that go with it, as what I would sometimes lazily call, it would be a no-brainer. It's one of those free lunches in life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe this question also, there was talk about some culture. You mentioned in your recent FT article, you talk about South Korea become really very successful, and also China, to that matter, as well. I mean, we have also Indonesia coming up very quickly. So do you think this kind of Asian culture, diligent, hardworking, central, government play a lot of role, and the coordination, and so would that make a, BRICS country a little different? I mean, even given your number of BRICS countries, it seems the countries, BRICS countries in Asia perform relatively well compared with other continents.
I mean, this is a fascinating issue, and I tried to. My original contribution to the FT was a longer length, where I actually tried to have a paragraph on this exact topic. Because back in the 2003 BRICS paper, we studied 50 years earlier what would a similar analysis have suggested about 2003. And what is fascinating is that already a number of North Asian societies reached the potential such an analysis would show. Japan, Hong Kong, and of course, South Korea, which in my opinion is arguably the most interesting country in the world of more than 45 million people since I was starting professional life, because today it's the only one that has a GDP per capita as those of European G7 members. It is an astonishing achievement. And it is a shining example, as is much of North Asia, for so many other ambitious countries around the world, and frankly, including Leslie's own South Africa, which has a similar population to that of South Korea, how can you achieve this shared prosperity in order to deliver a better life? And there are great virtues about the interconnection between some greater involvement of government, enormous use of education and technology. And I think it's something that many North Asian countries share really powerful evidence of, which whether it be Latin America or many countries in Africa, need to understand what they can adopt for their own societies and implement.
Leslie, do you have any comment on those questions? And of course, New Development Bank is doing all those great things. And so what do you think of the BRICS? There's actually a question about the concept, and when the first proposed is included 5 rapidly developing emerging countries, but now we have Jim mentioned about South Korea and also Indonesia and many other, Mexico you mentioned. So what do you think about other countries that can bring you talk about quite a number of join your banks? What do you see the potential as a whole for those emerging economies?
Thanks, Henry. I mean, I think, as I mentioned earlier on, I think one of the contributions that BRICS, and this is what Jim will always be credited for, and what the new development have done, as I said, is to create a coordinated voice for emerging markets, because all the other banks, all of them, Asia Development Bank, European Investment Bank, IFC, EBRD, and so on, all of them have a control structure in terms of who has the most votes dominated by the developed world. The New Development Bank and BRICS is a unique construct also from a global governance perspective, in a sense that here you have 5 countries coming together, very different sizes of economies, and yet have an equal say. China's got a GDP of 15.6 trillion, for example. It is 31 times bigger than South Africa. But South Africa also contributed $2 billion in equity, and China has no bigger say. It has no veto power. If you look at the control structures in the world since after the Second World War, when the IMF was formed, the World Bank, and so on, obviously the US was the biggest economy way back at 50% in 1944. So they entrenched control structures for themselves. But today, here you have the second largest economy sitting as an equal partner with a much smaller economy. So from a governance perspective, you also have a unique experiment which one can see as reasonably successful. Clearly, what is required now is to take a fresh look at globalization for countries like South Africa, for countries like Brazil, to see how can we become the South Koreas in the next couple of decades to come. There was I would argue, and time is too short now to sort of make the case that there was a sort of favorable period of globalization, which I think enabled the rise and growth of Korea. Favorable factors also here in Asia, which encouraged and enabled the industrialization of Korea over the 1970s, 80s, 90s into what, as Jim has said, now in a top 10 GDP per capita. But there's a lot of lessons we could certainly learn from Korea as a shining example of a country that was transformed from developing country GDP per capita in the 1960s. In fact, I think Korea had the same GDP per capita as Ghana, for example, today. And if you now look at the countries in economic size, it is just so different. So in short, I think that the world has changed quite fundamentally. And we need to derive lessons and extract what we can learn from those success stories to try and reproduce them.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, you said something very significant. You know, war has changed profoundly, and I think the governance system of new development banks. You know, every country is relatively equal and have a really important role to play, and that really fits Jim's vision. You know, that new emerging countries should be more into the globalization that after Bretton Woods system. You know, we should really reform that and participate more so that we can really reduce our geopolitical tension. We have more economic say and economic benefits of that. So that's really the spirit I think Jim has already demonstrated, 20 years ago, and you've been really practice that at the New Development Bank. And so that is really something we should really, other countries, particularly current developed world G7 and also international governance, we should think about, this kind of new governance style. I now have a final question actually from a Brazilian newspaper, also from the correspondent Marcelo Neill. He's the chief correspondent based here in China, and he heard about Jim will appear on my program, and he actually raised two questions from the All Global, which is a Brazilian major, one of the major Latin American correspondent in China. The first question is, comparing your expectation 20 years ago to the reality today, which of the BRICS countries disappoint you the most, and why do you think that had happened? First question. Second question, what should be the BRICS main focus today to help with a better global governance? So Jim, we will let you to answer this question raised to you.
Thank you. I know O Globo as a financial newspaper very well, and amongst the other great things about the BRICS acronym, it's allowed me to travel to that beautiful country, Brazil, many times. I'm going, in the spirit of trying to balance everything out, I'm going to contradict myself, but in a sense of humor. China has obviously been the most successful BRIC, but for me personally, in the spirit of what Brazil also represents, which is probably the greatest soccer football playing nation in the world, China is also the biggest disappointment because it never took ownership of my own obsession of Manchester United Football Club in England. And in the days of the great global, that brief period of the golden era between the UK and China, I had the privilege of being on that tour with President Xi, and his advisors allowed him to be succumb to going to visit Manchester City's ground and not Manchester United's ground. And I don't know how I failed in my ambition there. The second thing to say is of course, Brazil and Russia, as the journalist asking the question knows well, equally share the position of being the most disappointing. And in many ways, Brazil's is more than Russia's because Brazil has better demographics than Russia. But I quickly add, one of the, again, as people at O Globo and many other Brazilian newspapers know, Brazil is often, in some ways, the most unpredictable of the BRICS. I will never forget when I was there in 2010, when Brazil was doing so well. Many people, including representatives from O Globo, would ask me whether they thought Brazil could grow as strongly as China in the next decade. Literally, seriously. And I looked at them and said, you must be mad. But that year, of course, in 2009, they kind of had done nearly. And today, many people probably think Brazil can never grow ever again, which of course is equally ridiculous. So what I would say is, to finish for now, I think both Brazil, especially Brazil, certainly will not be anything like as disappointing as it's been the last decade. And maybe that's the case with both South Africa and Russia also. Hopefully, hopefully.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jim. And so actually today, we're coming to the close, and we have a very exciting discussion. You give us the history review and perspective of the BRICS countries, and also the role that how the BRICS countries can play in the global governance system, global health system, global economic system, and also how China, you have been giving high credit for China development, and also other BRICS countries like South Korea. So I think we have touched on many subjects, and particularly how the developed world, Western countries can really work with China. I mean, you give a lot of good advice on that, and so really appreciate. So I want to conclude with maybe your concluding remarks, and we start from Leslie. About our subject today, and other topics you want to finish with your concluding remark.
Thanks very much. Look, we are at a very interesting period, and it's an historic crossroads, really, where I think this whole drive towards the green transition will provide fresh impetus for institutions like ourselves. We are obviously hugely excited about becoming a much bigger, more emerging markets focused institution, becoming much bigger than what Jim dreamed of in 2001. I mean, over the next 5-6 years, I mean, I would anticipate that this bank is likely to have, 25, 30, 40, 50 members, and become a bigger emerging markets bloc that will make a profound contribution to the world of multilateralism. And within the space of 5-6 years, this institution has already made its mark in terms of its contribution. I'm very excited, and I think I share this with my colleagues about what this new phase entails. Now, the global pandemic has kind of depressed sentiment very much, Henry, as you know, but I think it seems to us that if we integrate our approaches around health and integrate that into sustainable development, we might be able to conquer this global pandemic through more coordinated global multilateral efforts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So Jim, and so we started with your Financial Times paper just 2 days ago. BRICS, how some of the disappointed you have. I mean, the editor gave you a very sensational title, but China probably is the least disappointing. China actually probably outperformed your expectations in terms
yes,
of
it did.
gold GDP development. So now we're having we're having a large audience of China today hear from you, and so what's your expectation for China, and how China can play a better role? I mean, you have always championed BRICS countries' role for the global development and global governance in the future.
Thank you, Henry. And again, listen, thank you so much for including me. I just want to also say one thing that I think, to reiterate in my own mind, something that Leslie said early on in this discussion that's so important. Even though 20 years is a long time in my lifetime, in the history of man and women and life, it's not. And as Leslie said, the BRICS Development Bank has only been in existence for 6 years. So I look forward to the discussion the three of us have in another decade when it's 30 years and 16 years, because it's important to keep that in perspective, because we live in an era where there is a lot of negative mood about so much. Second thing, and why I say it that way, is one thing I learned throughout my life at Goldman Sachs in particular is never let a crisis go to waste. Never. And the making of how most of us are as individuals, or any countries or any governments, is how you deal with a crisis. Crises will always happen. They are unavoidable because they are a consequence of human beings. And the key issue is we all need to respond to them properly. And again, Leslie's right about this one in COVID. This creates enormous opportunities for things to be thought about doing differently, including cooperation. And then thirdly, it leads me lastly to your specific point about China. I think as we can see and hear again, I hope I tread carefully in my words. I think we can see in recent years, China sometimes finds itself a little bit surprised about the scale of global focus on China. And of course, it's understandable because China's emergence has been so new. But as China gets more and more bigger, it has to find a better way of integrating its own thinking and what's right for its own citizens with the desires of the rest of the world. Every time I've ever, the 30 or 40 times I've been to China in my life, I'm always so remarkably impressed with the educational and technical abilities of so many people I meet. But I think in order for China to deal well with this next decade and beyond, it's got to find a slightly different way of positioning how it thinks and integrates with the rest of the world, which, by the way, is just as important for the rest of the world as it is for China's 1.3 billion people.
Yeah, that's really impressive, really great. Thank you, Jim. I think we are entering a very challenging time, and also challenging world, at probably once in a century that we are experiencing this pandemic. As you said rightly, that we should not let crisis wasted. We should really giving a new birth and a new system and improvement of our current global governance system. And for the last 76 years of the Second World War, we had a global governance, 0.10, 1.0, of course, global governance 1.0. Now we're getting the global governance 2.0. So I really thank you for your proposing the BRICS countries, proposing China, and give the credit of China performance. But I think the world should really work together and with the developing countries, with all the G20 countries. And I think that development banks actually has a very good example of how we can work together. So thank you for creating this concept 20 years ago, and now we have the chance to talk. And I hope that actually after another decade we can come talk again. So really appreciate your time, and thank you and Leslie for sharing your wisdom, and thank you so much, and also thank our audience tonight. Thank you. Okay, goodbye. Yes.
Thanks, Henry.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure to be part of this. Thank you very much, and best wishes to everybody.
Thank you.